Hello and welcome back. My name is Matthew Vaughn and this is Arts of Hermes. So this will be at least the final video for a while in the Occulture series. I'm going to leave it open and I'll definitely come back from time to time to add more material. There's still a lot of important stuff I did not get to. If you've seen the first video in this series, you'll know I gave quite a long list of things I wanted to talk about. Obviously, we've gotten to only a very small percentage of that, which is fine, I think. But yeah, I'll come back and continue to. There's definitely some really important material that we still haven't gotten to yet. Doing videos on people like Kenneth Anger and William Burroughs and other really significant figures. That I definitely want to talk about. But I also want to do other things besides talking about a culture and get into looking more directly at esoteric material and talking about actual magical practice and esoteric tradition. So after this video, I'll be starting up a series on Eliphas Levi, and we'll be reading through most of the main important works of Eliphas Levi, and then from there moving into talking about the Golden Dawn, and then from there to Aleister Crowley and Thelema, and then on into 20th century contemporary magical traditions from there. So as you have no doubt already figured out by looking at the title of the video, we are talking here about China Miéville's 2016 novella, The Last Days of New Paris. Now, this is definitely not, I think, one of Miéville's greater or more important works, and probably not the greatest starting place. If you are interested in getting into Miéville, I would recommend probably either Perdido Street Station or The City and the City as good entry points into his work. But I was interested in talking about Last Days of New Paris because of its relevance to this Occulture series and to other things that are to come on this channel. So quite a bit of the book concerns Surrealism, and at least one dimension of the book is a reflection on what the Surrealism movement meant and what its kind of implications were, what its power is, or more broadly about the power of art and the connection between artistic practice and more concrete political struggle. Now, the book is, as we will talk about, is set in what I kind of read anyways as a sort of cultural imaginary of World War II. In particular, we're set in a kind of alternate version of Vichy Paris, so the Nazi-occupied Paris. And it stages this confrontation between surrealism and fascism or Nazism. And I think in the way that it tries to think through or think about anti-fascist struggle and connecting it to these sort of artistic movements and these kind of magical and alternative spiritual sort of movements, I think that it continues to have relevance for today. And even in just the 10 years since Miéville published the novella, I think the increasing rise of neo-fascism in the United States and around the world, I think makes this book even more relevant. I think reflecting on the connections between art and magic and spirituality and anti-fascist struggle are all very timely and important things to reflect on. So we'll be kind of moving through a bunch of that material as we go through the video here today. So before we get into talking about the novella specifically, I want to just set some context and kind of set the stage in a way that I think will enhance our understanding of the novella, is useful for a reading of it, and will kind of get us into some of the deeper themes and concerns that we'll be working with here. So I don't want to read this through trying to understand Miéville's own intentions or read it simply through his own political commitment or ideas, but I do think this is a useful way of setting the stage here. So Miéville is primarily known as a writer of literature, mostly novels, though a handful of novellas, of which Last Days of New Paris is one, obviously, and I think 2 collections of short stories. Now, these works are often referred to as new weird or new weird fiction, which he's not the only one that gets referred to that way, but I think this may be a genre that was largely created to describe his works. At least the majority of them, they certainly come across as genre fiction, but they really don't fit neatly into any established genre. So we have elements of science fiction, elements of fantasy, horror, the weird fiction, what would be associated with people like H.P. Lovecraft or Clark Ashton Smith. So touching on these different genres, but sort of mixing them together and moving between them in a way that defies conventional categorization. Interestingly, I was recently reading an interview with him. It wasn't a particularly recent interview. I was just reading it recently, where he talked about this approach to genre being something of a kind of he referred to it as a post-Seattle approach to genre fiction. Now, Seattle referring there to the anti-globalization movement and the WTO protests that happened throughout the 1990s, which would have been, I'm trying to remember exactly when his first novel was published. It was either late 90s or early 2000s. So that would have been a very formative period for him. And I don't want to spend the time to try to unpack that, but I think that's interesting to think of even his approach to genre and his approach to to fantasy and science fiction and these sort of genres, or even the human imagination, that this is coming out of a particular political moment. But in addition to his literary works, he also has written a few nonfiction works. Let's see, he's written a book called A Spectre Haunting, which is a commentary on the Communist Manifesto. It's quite good. It's a really good commentary on the manifesto. Written another book called October, which covers the February 1917 revolution in Russia through the October revolution of that year, and tells the kind of history of that period of whatever that is, 8 or 9 months. Now, you can certainly see in his literary works, you can see elements of his socialist and Marxist political orientation, but it might not be especially obvious how those things connect together, the political concerns and the more aesthetic or imagination concerns. And in particular, Miéville's works really show a love of monsters and a concern with the monstrous. But I think surrealism, which is something that he says that he's always been interested in and was deeply interested in, and Last Days of New Paris is certainly the work where he engages with surrealism most directly, I think makes a really nice point of connection between this socialist, Marxist, communist orientation and his interest in genre fiction and weird fiction and fantasy and horror and sci-fi. So I think a useful place for looking at this conjunction, or the way that surrealism can draw together or contain these two seemingly very disparate domains of practice or understanding, is a lecture that Miéville gave at a socialism conference in 2013, which I think the conference actually happened on Halloween, called Marxism and Halloween, where he reflects on both a kind of Marxist or socialist approach to understanding not just the holiday of Halloween, but the whole genre of horror and monsters and fairly Gothic concepts like haunting, and also tries to understand how those sorts of this kind of imagination and fantasy literature and the experience of dread and horror, how those things are relevant to a political project. So in the course of this lecture, he refers to Gothic Marxism, which, as I believe Miéville notes in the lecture, is a term coined by Margaret Cohen in her 1993 book, Profane Illumination, which is about Walter Benjamin and surrealism generally, but especially or specifically the works of André Breton. So it's in this context of a discussion of surrealism that she coins this term, Gothic Marxism. We'll look in just a minute at a few quotations from the earlier portion of her book there, and as she's setting up the term and saying how she understands it, because I think that'll be useful for our discussion here. We'll also look at another book that Miéville quotes by Michael Lervy. Also, maybe worth noting, this term, Gothic Marxism, I think has gotten increased usage since the time of Miéville's, since the time of that lecture in 2013. And I think that lecture has had some influence. I know that John Greenaway, who is an important figure in the contemporary kind of discussion around this idea of Gothic Marxism, he published a book called Capitalism, a Horror Story. What was that, like 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now? And also has a podcast called Horror Vanguard. He's got a blog, and he's done a number of other writings too. And I know that he cites hearing that lecture of Miéville's as an important influence on his own kind of orientation or his own getting into this project of thinking about a Gothic Marxism. So to get us started off thinking about Gothic Marxism here, we will look at a passage from Michael Lervie's book, Morning Star, Surrealism, Marxism, Anarchism, Situationism, Utopia, which Miéville's lecture actually quotes from the passage that we're going to read here. It's the second sentence in the passage we got here is what Miéville quotes in his lecture, but we'll look at the more substantial passage surrounding that. So Lervie writes, "It's unnecessary to say that Breton's Marxism did not coincide with the official Vulgate of the Comintern. The Comintern, also known as the Third International, the Second International had broken up around the time of the outbreak of World War I, and then the Third International was founded after the war. But in the period that's relevant here, basically the first half of the 1930s, when Breton and many of the other Surrealists were members of and involved with the PCF, the French Communist Party, both the Comintern and the French Communist Party were increasingly dominated by the Stalinist bureaucracy, which, as Lervie is going to go on to unpack here, was just totally incompatible with the Surrealist understanding of Marxism and the project of the revolutionary transformation of society. Let's see, so Lervie goes on. Perhaps one might call it a Gothic Marxism, that is, a historical materialism sensitive to the marvelous, to the dark moment of revolt, to the illumination which pierces, like lightning, the sky of revolutionary action. In other words, a reading of Marxist theory inspired by Rimbaud, Lautréamont, and the English Gothic novel, Lewis, Maturin, without losing sight, even for an instant, of the vital need to combat the bourgeois order. It might seem paradoxical to unite like communicating vessels, capital with the Castle of Otranto, the origin of the family in A Season in Hell, state and revolution in Melmoth. But it was at that singular moment that André Breton's Marxism was formed in all its unsettling originality. So we get a series of conjunctions or kind of marvelous encounters here between, on the one hand, classics of Marxist literature, like Marx's great work on political economy, Capital, Engels' The Origin of the Family, Lenin's State and Revolution, with two Gothic novels, The Castle of Otranto and Melmoth the Wanderer, and Rimbaud's kind of rebellious, radical, kind of proto-symbolist and even proto-surrealist prose poem, A Season in Hell. So I think there's, as Lervie is definitely attuned to here, it's both that this conjunction of these seemingly very incompatible elements, this kind of cold, hard Marxist, analysis of economy and the formation and development and transformation of societies, with, this seemingly quite irrational tradition of Gothic literature and symbolist poetry. So the bringing together of these things is formative for Breton's understanding of Marxism, but and surrealism more generally. But it's also that there's something particularly surreal in this conjunction. Rather like Lautréamont's famous image of the chance encounter on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Here we have the chance encounter on a dissecting table of Capital and the Castle of Otranto. So there's both something formative of surrealism in that meeting and something inherently surrealist in the meeting itself, that perhaps it's only kind of from a surrealist sort of point of view that we can understand the elective affinity, to use a term that Lervie likes, between this sort of Gothic symbolist, romantic tradition and this kind of scientific, harder kind of economic thinking from the Marxist tradition. Which so these two things definitely correspond with what's sometimes called the warm and cold streams within Marxism, this more kind of imaginative tradition, so the warm stream being the more imaginative tradition associated with sort of the desire for liberation and the kind of dreams of a better society and the possibilities of transformation. And then the cold stream, the more hard kind of scientific economic analysis of capital and its mechanics. There's also something, perhaps a bit of what we will see playing out in the novella between art and political action. It doesn't correspond exactly, but the meeting of that imaginative practice with the sort of concrete political struggle, I think has some resonance here in these conjunctions that Lervy's thinking about. Let's see. So Lervy goes on. In any case, this Marxism, like that of Jose Carlos Mariátegui, probably mispronouncing that, Walter Benjamin, Ernst Bloch, and Herbert Marcuse, draws upon the subterranean current running through the 20th century, beneath the immense blockades constructed by orthodoxy, romantic Marxism. By this I mean a kind of thought which is fascinated by certain cultural forms of the pre-capitalist past, and which rejects the cold, abstract rationality of modern industrial civilization, but which changes that nostalgia into a force in the battle for the revolutionary transformation of the present. So this, obviously, the Gothic novel is very deeply related to the Romantic movement, and I think another thing that we can see, although this isn't like specifically addressed in the novella, we can kind of see in the battle between surrealism and sort of fascism or Nazism especially, a kind of internal battle for the understanding the importance or legacy or significance of the Romantic movement. Bertrand talks about surrealism as the tale or the prehensile tale of the Romantic movement. But it's also a different side, the more nationalist, conservative, reactionary side of Romanticism that is deeply formative for fascism, and for Nazism. So there's almost something like a kind of war within the Romantic tradition happening. As well, that I think is quite interested to be attuned to, especially when we start bringing in this kind of esoteric dimension, because all modern esotericism really, or at least to a very great, not entirely, but to a very great extent, all modern esoteric traditions draw on the Romantic movement and the Romantic revival. And I think especially if we understand Romanticism not as sort of a counter-enlightenment, but as something of a kind of alternative enlightenment, an enlightenment that includes, the unconscious and desire and dreams, and is even open to the possibility of magic and the marvelous and things that exceed a kind of narrow rationalist idea or a kind of vulgar materialism. So I think there's a lot of really interesting material here, and we can definitely start to unpack some of that as we go through the video here. All right, and then I've got 3 passages from the opening chapter of Margaret Cohen's book, Profane Illumination, Walter Benjamin and the Paris of Surrealist Revolution, which, as I mentioned, is the book that coins the term Gothic Marxism. And I think it does a really nice job of setting up some of the themes that we'll see throughout the novella, Last Days of New Paris. So let's see, Cohen writes of Gothic Marxism as a Marxist genealogy fascinated with the irrational aspects of social processes, a genealogy that both investigates how the irrational pervades existing society and dreams of using it to effect social change. Gothic Marxism has often been obscured in the celebrated battles of mainstream Marxism, privileging a conceptual apparatus constructed in narrowly Enlightenment terms. The Enlightenment, however, was always already haunted by its Gothic ghosts, and the same can be said of Marxism from its inception. So this idea of Marxism being, haunted by these Gothic ghosts is obviously a reference to the famous opening sentence of the Communist Manifesto, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, which of course Miéville is also chooses as the title of his book, the commentary on the Communist Manifesto, which he titles A Specter Haunting. that commentary itself doesn't really go into that sort of Gothic dimension, but you can just see Miéville's own kind of Gothic Marxist orientation in the choice of that title. Yeah, so here we're seeing not just this conjunction of of the Gothic with the Marxist, but in that conjunction, we retroactively see that Marxism, like the Enlightenment, has been Gothic all the way through. That Romanticism, again, although it's often understood as a kind of anti-Enlightenment or a kind of counter-Enlightenment, really isn't sort of separate from it and includes within itself those aspects of human society and culture and its transformative process, all of the things that the Enlightenment, like mainstream Marxism or what we refer to as the cold stream of Marxism, rejects. All right, and then in our next quote from Cohen here, she writes, "It was in the process of trying to accommodate Surrealism to this Marxism that Breton devised his bold attempt to reconcile Engels and Freud. Breton modified practical Marxist notions of subjectivity, historical process, causality, praxis, and event with psychoanalytic concepts and content, while he wandered through a landscape reworking 19th century representations of Paris Noir, Gothic Paris." This highlighting of the importance of psychoanalysis for basically the genesis of this Gothic Marxism, I think is important. Now today, especially if you have some familiarity with a kind of critical theory or continental philosophy, the idea of bringing Freud and Marx together seems kind of obvious. I mean, it's been huge. The Frankfurt School, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Adorno, all those sort of people, to greater or lesser extent, bring Freud and Marx together, and then on to people like Slavoj Žižek, who is now I think probably the most famous living philosopher in the world today. Marxism and psychoanalysis together are hugely important for all of those projects, but it really, and as I think is not that often acknowledged, that really comes out of Breton and the Surrealist movement, and is obviously a really powerful and productive and continues to be a powerful and productive conjunction of these intellectual and really quite radical traditions. Also, in the more specific context of this novella, Last Days of New Paris, which stages a conflict between Surrealism and fascism, I think it's worth appreciating how threatening to fascist projects psychoanalysis really is. Now, the Nazis aren't the only, anti-Semitic fascists, but obviously anti-Semitism is incredibly central to the Nazi project in a way it's not for most other fascist movements. So that gives them an extra reason to hate, Freud and psychoanalysis. Freud and of course, basically the entire first generation of psychoanalysts, except for Jung, are all Jewish. So that anti-Semitism is obviously playing a big role there in their real hatred and violent rejection of psychoanalysis. But even in places like in Latin America in the 1970s and things like that, various sort of fascist or other kind of right-wing reactionary movements, when they're burning books, Freud is right up there with Marx or Lenin or Neruda in the material that's being targeted. And that might be something to have in the back of our minds as we read through the novella and think about this conflict within the political and cultural imagination, and the way that the surrealist openness to the unconscious and their understanding of the kind of contradictory nature of humans themselves and all human projects is just radically incompatible with the fascist project. In any case, let's just keep moving on here. So let's see, Cohen writes, "Uncanny landscapes, ghosts and sorcerers, strange stones and constructions, Illuminati. To these will be added such surrealist concepts as objective chance, intersubjective desire, the lucky find, the encounter, the dream, bohemian resistance, the social unconscious, and the capillary tissue connecting the communicating vessels of psychic and material life." And we will see quite a bit of that throughout the Last Days of New Paris. Right, and then our last quotation from Cohen before we get into looking at Last Days of New Paris directly. She writes, "If images from the past spring to legibility in the present, it is because they speak to its concerns." Now, I think we could really apply that to Last Days of New Paris itself, that these images from World War II spring to legibility 75 years later at the time that that Miéville is writing the novella, not because he's necessarily interested in sort of understanding World War II or the resistance or the Nazi occupation of Paris for its own sake, but for the way that conflict speaks to to our times now, and the what's now a century of fascism and anti-fascism, and that continuing struggle, and the understanding that in that moment, and this kind of imagination and imaginative elaboration, and the giving the surrealists a really, historically speaking, a disproportionately large role in the resistance to the Nazi occupation, but because it speaks to our concerns now in this moment. Anyways, Cohen goes on. The most suggestive material rescued here includes 1. The valorization of the realm of a culture's ghosts and phantasms as a significant and rich field of social production, rather than a mirage to be dispelled. And so again, we'll see this both happening in the novella, like at the time of World War I, in the past of the sort of present of the literary work. But then again, we could also say that about the work and its looking back to World War II. Let's see, she goes on. 2. The valorization of a culture's detritus and trivia, as well as its strange and marginal practices. 3. A notion of critique moving beyond logical argument and the binary opposition to a phantasmagorical staging more closely resembling psychoanalytic therapy, privileging non-rational forms of working through. And then she goes on to add items like 4, 5, and maybe 6, but we'll just sort of stop there. Those are ones I think most relevant to Last Days of New Paris and our discussion here today. And yeah, I just like this idea of a non-rational working through and a kind of cultural sort of psychoanalysis, which again I think would be an interesting way of framing what's happening in Last Days of New Paris, and the way this kind of imaginative like elaboration and kind of fantasy on the struggle of that time, being a kind of like cultural psychoanalysis or a journey into these sort of hidden reaches of the cultural imagination and its unconscious and its contradictions. All right, so with that context in place, or at least sketched out, we can move into looking at the novella more directly. So I think it's important to understand the structure of the novella. It's divided into 3 sections. The first and the longest section is the main narrative, which occupies about 170 pages out of the total of sort of just over 200 pages that make up the whole book. So this main narrative, this is really like the Last Days of New Paris proper. And then following that, we get a frame narrative, a fictionalized account of how Miéville came to write Last Days of New Paris, which I think is quite important, and we'll spend a bit of time looking at it. And we'll actually look at it first. We'll look at this stuff out of order because I think that the frame narrative helps to understand what some of the deeper significance of what the main narrative is about. And then finally, we're not really going to talk about this directly, but at the end, he also gives source notes where so in the main narrative, we get, or what really occupies a good majority of the main narrative, is a series of encounters or appearances of beings and landscapes and images drawn from surrealist paintings and writings and poetry that manifest themselves into the reality or the world of New Paris. Now, these source notes are incorporated into the idea of the frame narrative, that he, like in the frame narrative, as we'll talk about, he received this story that might be true in some sense. And then he's framing the source notes as if he then had to go do research to find the origins of these images. But of course, it's really the other way around. He's telling us where he got the images from, right? I think it's important that he gives these source notes here. I think otherwise, without them, the main narrative would come off as not exactly pretentious, but like setting forth a kind of like puzzle or kind of scavenger hunt, game for readers to try to identify the source for as many images as possible. But by simply giving us the source notes at the end of the book, I think he just sort of makes that a non-issue, and we can move on to thinking about the significance of their appearance and how they're used and things like that, without just sort of playing this kind of I don't know, sort of scavenger hunt game of like how many sources can we track down and identify. Now, something that's not actually mentioned in the book, but I think is helpful in understanding some of why the narrative is the way that it is that the world of the world of New Paris, and perhaps some of the narrative itself, I'm not really sure on the details, were developed as a possible setting for a video game. But that fell through, and the material that Miéville had developed for the game was repurposed into the narrative, Last Days of New Paris. And then obviously the frame narrative was added later. But I think there's a lot of things that happen in the narrative, and the, sort of the way that things happen, or the kind of feel of it, makes a lot of sense as a video game. You can kind of see him like collecting items and like gaining new powers, and then increase, whatever, facing various kind of bosses and things like that would have to be overcome. Yeah, and then this also is going to influence the reading I want to do here, where I'm going to focus less on those aspects of it that are obviously just a kind of video game feeling of like increasing, challenges and, leveling up and, gaining powers or whatever other kind of, video game sort of mechanics and ideas are there, and just sort of focus on some of the details and some of the kind of world building and the deeper significances here. But I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the specific narrative progression that, I think is quite obviously rooted in that sort of video game ideas around a narrative and narrative progression. All right, so we'll start off with a general kind of summary of the book, and just look a little bit at the various, there's essentially 3 different timelines across 2 worlds or 2 realities that all interact in various ways, which can be a little, I think, confusing or disorienting. Definitely was to me the first time I read it. So we'll kind of work through some of that, and then start looking at some of the details drawn from the book. All right, so in the frame narrative, the frame narrative is essentially set in what is basically our world. It's the timeline is the same as our own history, and the world is essentially as it is in our world. The only difference here being that there's this fictionalized account of how Thibault, who is the protagonist of Last Days of New Paris, he crosses over from his world into our world, and then tells the story to Miéville, who then takes detailed notes and then adapts those notes into the novella that we are reading. So this is the way that the story is framed is as an account, a kind of secondhand account of the events that took place within this other world or this other reality. What I think is perhaps most important to realize here is that we have this sort of crossing over from the realm of kind of the imaginal or the sort of cultural imagination, and the conflict that occurs there in this world of this world of the imagination that then crosses over or kind of impinges on our world, and then that opens up a question about the relation between these 2 worlds, which is, if not exactly, but is very closely related to the question about the role of art in political and social change, and how artistic practice and artistic production, how that interacts with the more concrete struggle or political struggle for change in society. Something of this sort of split, but then also the crossing over in between, and the challenging or blurring of the distinction between the worlds, and the questions about what the relationships between them are, becomes a kind of vehicle for thinking about these other these other questions that are part of our world. And then in our main narrative, which is essentially the last days of New Paris proper, we cut back and forth between two different time periods. We are just dropped straight into the 1950 story, which is Paris is still under Nazi occupation in an incredibly bizarre and disorienting version of Paris. We then cut back and forth, like chapter to chapter, between 1950, which functions as essentially the present for the main narrative, and then 1941, where we see some of how the world got to be the way that it is, and some of the significance of that. So this cutting back and forth, like chapter by chapter, between these two different time periods, along with the style that Miéville writes the novel in, which is very fragmentary. There's a lot of like parataxis and sentence fragments, and a lot of just very quick jumping from one event to another, or even in the action scenes. We get this really kind of rapid and not at all like fragmentary progression through events, which, I mean, in some ways, it heightens the kind of the action that the whole book feels like kind of hyperkinetic. But I think it also echoes surrealist practices of collage, that the fragmentary nature of the novel echoes some of the fragmentary artworks, and especially the exquisite corpses, which we will see play a substantial and important role in the narrative, and I think also in a lot of its thematic developments as well. And it's worth appreciating that happens both at the level of the narrative structure and even the style, the prose style that the novel is written in. And I think it'll be useful to just take a brief look at some of the main points of the timeline, both the larger world events as well as the particular story and the particular characters that we follow through the novella. And we can do this in chronological order rather than following the narrative sequence as we actually read it. So in the earliest bits from 1941, the world up until that point is basically the same as in our world. It's implied that it has the same history, at least approximately. The one thing that is different about this world is kind of a metaphysical sort of difference. So magic here is more literally real than it is in our world. Now, the way that magic is presented, although Miéville is using real magical traditions, Aleister Crowley, and real magical practitioners like Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons, and making reference to Thelema, and the actual surrealist interest in esotericism and esoteric concepts, it's being presented in a kind of exaggerated fantasy version here in the novella. But then in the distinction within the novella between the world of New Paris and then the world of the frame narrative, magic is more real in the world of New Paris than in the frame narrative. So yeah, so the timeline is basically as in our world, but with magic, literally real here. As will also be clear, as the novella, as the sort of 1941 timeline opens, the Nazis are in discussion with the forces of the demons and devils of hell, who, although hell is sort of literally real, and these demons and devils eventually physically manifest into the world of New Paris, it's not like a Judeo-Christian understanding of it. It is a kind of underworld full of monstrous beings, but we're not falling into some sort of like good and evil kind of cosmology here. So anyways, the Nazis are in a way, Miéville's obviously playing on this kind of larger cultural trope of the, occult Nazism and the idea of the Nazis conducting all these sort of forbidden, occult experiments here. But yeah, that's all kind of happening in the opening. Now, in the story we follow, we have Jack Parsons, who we'll talk more about who Parsons is in just a moment here. We have Parsons doing something that he doesn't actually do in our timeline. So here's where things kind of start to diverge. He ends up traveling to Marseille, where the surrealists who have left Paris are, as they actually did, are awaiting in Marseille the possibility of being able to get out of France and come. Most of them end up in New York. Some go to Mexico City. but they're trying to get out of France here. And then Parsons ends up meeting them there on his way to Prague, where he intends to make a golem, or to find the secrets to make a golem to fight in the war. Now, this is total fabrication. Parsons did not travel to France or intend to go to Prague at this time here. So here's where things kind of start to diverge. And now Parsons will blend his own magical practices and some of the rudiments of what would have been the kind of golem construction technology with the surrealist practice and a kind of magical power that's generated by these collective games and experiments that the surrealists are undertaking in Marseille to create a kind of bomb. But this is an important thing to recognize, that this bomb is stolen and goes off in a way that's not intended. Parsons does intend to use this as a weapon to help defeat the Nazis, but it doesn't go off as intended. It kind of goes wrong, and so we get this explosion in Paris. Now, interesting to note too that this explosion happens at the Café the Deux Magots, which is the place that the surrealists. No, of course, the surrealists aren't there. Most of them are in exile already in Marseille, but the location that it happens is significant. So this was the actual location where the surrealists held their regular meeting. So it's obviously very intentionally symbolically chosen. And so the explosion, which is referred to as the S blast, goes off in 1941 at the Café at the Deux Magots. And then this is what really radically changes and alters the world. It kind of fractures and fragments reality and brings surrealist art, as well as various dreams and aspects of the unconscious of the surrealists and other denizens of Paris to manifest physically into this world of New Paris. And then because of this, and because of this outbreak of surrealist art into the world in Paris, the Nazis essentially contain and isolate Paris from the rest of the world. But then in this version of the world, the World War II continues and doesn't end. So in 1950, and really even at the end of the novel, this conflict continues to go on. So it's never quite explained what's happened in the rest of Europe outside of Paris, and how World War II is progressing outside of New Paris. But the conflict continues now for like a decade. So in 1950, we now have a kind of ongoing warfare between the Nazis, who continue to occupy the city and isolate it and contain it, and some of the surrealists who remain within the city and now fight a kind of guerrilla warfare using aspects of surrealist art and these various kind of magical, enchanted artifacts that they now have access to fight against the Nazi occupations, becoming a kind of magical surrealist sort of version of the resistance. And so the story we follow is the protagonist, Thibaut, who's a kind of young man who joins this surrealist group of guerrilla fighters called the Man à Plume, who we'll talk about in a few minutes here. He joins them to fight against the occupation, and so we follow him. Or I think he joins in kind of is it 43? I think it is. He joins like a couple of years after the S blast and after all this has been happening. So we follow him and several different companions that he makes along the way, who we're not really going to worry about the specifics of it here. So we follow them traveling through this kind of surreal, war-torn version of Paris, and engaging in various combats with Nazis and other like demons, and even some of the more dangerous manifestations of the surrealist art as they move through the city. They investigate this Nazi plot known as Fall Rot. And then eventually that ends up kind of functioning as, in a way, like the final boss battle with this creature that the Nazis have made. And then finally, at the very end, we have a battle with a kind of manifestation of Adolf Hitler out of one of Hitler's own works of art. And then there's no real conclusion here. The struggle simply continues. the Nazis sort of almost win, and then Thibault, with the help of his companions, managed to overturn that. But then we end up the situation largely just continuing, and the struggle continuing. And then even it's sort of implied that in the present day, in the frame narrative where Thibault kind of crosses over into our world, in his world of New Paris, that struggle between the Surrealist guerrillas and the Nazi occupation, it continues on. Which, again, I think if we read New Paris as a kind of imaginal realm, or a sort of something like the cultural imagination, it's like in the unconscious of our actual world, that conflict with fascism continues, and that's obviously true. I mean, fascism is still a major threat here in the United States and around the world. I think it's quite interesting to consider what is implied by Thibault's his ability to sort of ingress into the world of, if not exactly our world, into the world of the frame narrative, which is basically set up as if it was our world, where elements of this world where, as we've said, a kind of fantasy version of magic is literally real, unlike in the world of the frame narrative, or what's implied to be our world where magic is not real. There is a crossover, and there is some ability for this kind of magical world to affect the real material world, where if we understand, especially because of the ability to, at least some limited ability to move between them, implying that they are actually two parts of a single world, or a single kind of universe, a single world system, we end up with something that is much closer to what actual magical practitioners typically think and how they understand their practice. That it does happen to a great extent through imagination and symbol, and these things that are understood conventionally to not be real, and yet they affect the real world, and the seemingly meaningless material reality sometimes speaks in this kind of magical voice, and symbol and omen appear in the real world, as if that boundary were violated from both sides. And of course, this, I think, touches very deeply on what the Surrealist project is itself, of understanding the way that dream and waking reality are not separate realities, and that the conscious and the unconscious are linked, and that's the image of the communicating vessels that we saw both Lervy and Cohen using that image of, taken from Andre Breton, of this kind of these secret connections between apparently separated and isolated things. Thibault's ingress into our world kind of functions like that sort of communicating vessel, where these apparently isolated metaphysical realms gain a kind of mysterious, ambiguous connection to each other. So I'm definitely not suggesting that Miéville is consciously intending that, or that reflects his own worldview, but I think it is an interesting thing that's kind of produced out of the various narrative events and the movement between the worlds. All right, so now with a little bit of understanding of the general plan, I'm going to follow the same kind of order of talking through things, but really try to flesh it out here a bit for the rest of the video here. So we'll start by looking at the frame narrative again in a little more detail, and then move on to the world of New Paris. All right, so this is from the end of the frame narrative here in this passage, and the one we'll see on the next screen are really the ending of the frame narrative. So this is all after Thibault has told his story to this kind of fictional alter ego of Miéville within the frame narrative, and then disappeared again, presumably back into New Paris to continue the struggle. So in this first sentence here, Miéville refers to the visitor, that's Thibault, and then the woman, this is a presumably totally fictional character who Miéville knew from university, who I think goes on to be a professor, and then somehow Thibault gets in touch with her, and then she makes the contact with Miéville and gets Thibault and Miéville to meet in this hotel room in Paris for, I think it's like 3 days, where Thibault tells his whole story to Miéville. So we read, just why the visitor and the woman wanted the history of New Paris told, I have no idea. I feel it may be germane somehow that a good number of the manifs or manifs, however that was intended to be pronounced, these are the manifestations, manif is short for manifestation, of the surrealist artworks, who manifest in the world of New Paris as literal entities within that world. So a good number of the manifs seem to originate in artworks that, in our world, post-date the moment of the S-blast in theirs, meaning that they were created after 1941. But despite the S-blast bringing them into the world of New Paris in 1941. What that might say about the relations between our realities, whether there are certain pieces that insist on being born, whatever the contingencies of a timeline, whether there are certain manifesting forces that reach across what might otherwise seem impermeable barriers of ontology, taking or leaving traces, I don't know. So I think what's being implied here too is that because the timelines are so different, some of the pieces that manifest within New Paris never have the opportunity to be created because the history after 1941 is so radically different that the artworks that are manifesting in the world of New Paris are coming from the world of the frame narrative, so that it's artworks that are created, which again I think points towards this. How I'm reading it as the world of New Paris is something like a kind of the world of the cultural imagination, that the manifs are manifesting out of the frame narrative and then appearing within the imaginal reality in a kind of reverse movement to Thibaut, like crossing over into the real world. All right, and then just continuing on here, we read, 3 weeks after my meeting in the hotel, the meeting with Thibaut, I was in a cafe in Stepney considering our encounter. I chanced to look up, straight through the storefront, at a man standing outside looking through the glass at me. That is, I think he was looking at me. I can't be sure. Food was displayed on the shelves in the window, and from where I sat, an apple blocked my view of the man's face. I could see him beyond it, coated and hatted, unmoving. The apple obscured his eyes, nose, his mouth. Still, I think he was staring at me. I drew breath at last, and he was gone, too fast for me to ever see his face. Perhaps some understanding of the nature of the manifs of New Paris, of the source and power of art and manifestation, may be of some help to us in our time to come. So this image of the man with the apple blocking his face is obviously a reference to the very well-known painting of René Magritte's The Son of Man, which you see here on the screen. So the fact that this happens in the world of the frame narrative, I think again is another place where the boundaries between the worlds is crossed over, and now we have essentially a manif appearing in the world of the frame narrative. It's sort of framed as a chance thing. He says, I chanced to look up, which I don't think is an accidental word choice. I think that's intentionally, calling the surrealist interest in the surrealist concept of objective chance, and that it's through objective chance that the manifs, come into the world of the frame narrative. So again, we have this very ambiguous kind of crossing back and forth between between art and reality, between dream and reality, and what's framed within the two parts of the book as these two separate worlds here. And then this final paragraph, again, touching on things that I've already said here in this video about the nature of the manifs and their power, and how the world of the imaginal and the material physical world, or the kind of the world of social and political struggle and events, the way that those relate to each other, and that understanding this can be of some help to us in our time, and understanding our own struggles, and understanding how cultural change happens and how we can intervene into culture and how that relates to political struggle. All right, so what we're going to do now for the rest of this video is just jump around within the main narrative and look at some selected passages without worrying too much about the plot line or the characters or anything like that, but just looking at some of the passages and kind of unpacking and reflecting on thematic and symbolic and philosophical and political and esoteric material that we can extract from it. However, although we'll be jumping around, I think it makes sense to look at some of the 1941 material first before we move into the 1950 stuff, because of the way the 1941 material sets up and acts as a backstory for everything that happens in 1950. So the crucial thing that happens in the 1941 sections, or at least crucial for our purposes here in this video, is the link that is established between surrealism and surrealist ideas and practices and politics with that of Thelema, the philosophical and magical and esoteric tradition that comes out of the practices and ideas and the magical orders headed by Aleister Crowley, and then further developed by his various students and magical orders and others inspired by his ideas going forward. Thelema is, I think, at least a contender for being the most important magical tradition of the 20th century, and remains extremely important and is still quite active and alive today. So in the narrative that's set up, in the fictional narrative here, Ithell Colquhoun plays the kind of, sort of comes to embody the conceptual link between Thelema and surrealism. We talked about Colquhoun, at least briefly, in the long video I did on surrealism, and we'll certainly be returning to her works in some future videos. She's an incredible artist, a really fascinating and interesting writer, a lot of really interesting magical ideas in her own right, but there's more of her writings that I still haven't gone through, and some other things I want to do first before we can really devote some serious time to looking at her work and ideas more directly. But Colquhoun doesn't actually appear in the narrative as a character herself. She's simply referred to by other characters in the story. So the actual act, and the same thing is true of Crowley, and we only see Breton rather briefly and kind of peripherally. He doesn't play a major role in the narrative. The main character that we follow in 1941 is Jack Parsons, who, as I'm sure some people watching this video will be familiar, was an important rocket engineer who made some major developments in rocket fuels, which ended up being a lot of the kind of foundations for the space program. Parsons, like some of his similar kind of parallel figures in the Soviet space program, Parsons, I think, is quite interesting for the way that he is inspired by science fiction and takes ideas out of the realm of the imagination, and is, with a real visionary capacity for understanding how those ideas, could be actualized and manifested in the in the material world, and begins doing this at a time when people really don't see rocketry as a really practical or workable method for human space travel. In addition to being a rocket engineer, and of course, in Parsons' mind, these two things would be totally united together. Parsons was also a student of Aleister Crowley and a magical practitioner who developed some of his own ideas. He's a very important figure in the history of the reception and development of Thelema in the United States. He was based in Pasadena, in Los Angeles and in Southern California, and plays a really important role there. He's definitely more well-known nowadays, especially since the TV series Strange Angel came out, which I only saw season 1 and honestly was not a big fan of it, and they really took some liberties with Thelema and sort of Thelemic ritual and ideas that I did not think worked very well. But in any case, in our Last Days of New Paris, we have a fictionalized version of Parsons who is in Marseille and in 1941, intending to go on to Prague to learn the secrets of building a golem, which he then intends to use as a weapon against the Nazis in the war. However, while he's in Marseille, he has a chance encounter with a member of the Surrealists there, and sees on the cover of a publication that he is carrying Ithell Colquhoun's name, which he recognizes and understands this as a significant chance occurrence, and then that brings him into contact with the Surrealist group in exile in Marseille. So now Parsons in Last Days of New Paris, he says that he knows Colquhoun's name through Aleister Crowley, who had mentioned her and spoken highly of her. I actually don't know that Crowley was ever really particularly aware of Colquhoun, and I don't know that he would have had a particularly positive opinion of her. She was certainly aware of him, and she did not like him. In part, I think this is because they were actually quite similar, and their ideas were quite similar. So in a way, they're maybe not exactly a narcissism of small differences, but because I think there's something really kind of convergent about their ideas and their practices, it also made them a bit rivals. Though again, I don't know how aware of Crowley ever was of her. So this is definitely a fictionalized aspect of the story. But nevertheless, I still think she's a perfect person to play that role of intermediary between these traditions. And I think there's a deep, whatever her personal feelings about Crowley or Thelema, there's a very deep affinity between her ideas and her practices and her work and that of Thelema. So it's, if fictionalized, is still, I think, perfectly appropriate. So Parsons initially has his encounter with a man named Varian Fry, who I don't know a ton about, to be honest. He was an American journalist who was in France in 1941 in some of the early parts of the war, and helped to smuggle out, I think, about 2,000 people, mostly artists and intellectuals and important cultural figures, many of whom were Jewish, though in the case of the Surrealists, not all of them, just people who were in danger from the Nazi occupation, and helped to get them out of France and to safety. And these people that he helped included André Breton and Max Ernst and a bunch of the other Surrealists. So in this fictional story, Parsons has his encounter with Fry, who's carrying a Surrealist publication. I don't know in reality how much awareness Fry helped a number of the Surrealists. I don't know how interested in Surrealist ideas Fry ever really was, but in any case, he functions as the link here in this narrative. So anyways, this is from a dialogue that they're having. "I'm going to level with you," Parsons was gabbling. "I want to go to Prague because if I get there are some words I think I can make do things they wouldn't normally do." This is an interesting line. The explicit reference here is to the use of, the Hebrew alphabet and the Hebrew language in the animation of a golem. But I think there's also a kind of subtext here about art and writing, and that somehow in this charged moment, a certain kind of magical surrealist use of language has a kind of power that language doesn't ordinarily have. So yeah, just interesting the way this is phrased here. Anyways, he continues, "But now everyone's saying I can't get there. So there I am, wondering what to do, and I see you, and I see what you're carrying." That would be the publication with Colquhoun's name on it. "And that is why I came running after you, because I do not believe in coincidence." Fry smiled. "I have a friend who would agree with you," he said. "Objective chance, he'd call it." So skipping a little bit ahead in their conversation, Parsons says, "Like I said, there's something I wanted to do in Prague. Now I'm stuck here. But what if that's okay? This guy I got a lot of respect for. Well, he has a lot of respect for Colquhoun." That's Crowley he's talking about. He has a lot of respect for Colquhoun. So if she's one of these surrealists, maybe they have the same kind of ideas he does, and I do. So maybe I want to talk to them, to your pals. "My friend who knows her is called Andre," said Fry after a long silence. "Mine's called Aleister. André Breton, Aleister Crowley." So now that link is set up there. All right, and then jumping forward in the 1941 timeline, Parsons makes contact with the Surrealists and ends up staying with them and spending some evenings with them, and is witness to them playing Surrealist games and engaging in these group activities of generating Surrealist materials, which initially Parsons is not impressed by. So let's see, we read, "His hosts played games of whispering, hearing, and mishearing each other's words. They played games of attention and chance. They played games of absurdity and misunderstanding. Fry watched with affectionate interest, Miriam with fascination. Mary Jane smoked in the doorway, her arms around Raymond. We're not going to worry about who these characters are here. He, meaning Parsons, radiated disdain. The games produced strange figures and sentences that made no sense, but that too made Parsons' breath come quick. Do what thou wilt. Do what thou wilt, of course, is the kind of central tenet or maxim within the Thelemic tradition. The Surrealists drew and hid what they drew, folded paper to obscure it. They passed their papers around and added to each other's unseen images. Watching, Parsons breathed out in time to a gust of wind that rattled a forgotten painting in a tree's canopy outside. Oh, he thought with a rush as they passed their papers again. Each drew a head and hid it and passed it. Each drew a body and passed it again. Each drew a leg or a base, so they are making exquisite corpses here, which we will talk about in a bit here. Oh, I get it. I get it. He rocked in his chair. He understood the link between his Colquhoun, the occultist, the hermeticist, tapping into the world's backways, and the Colquhoun close to this austere, courteous Breton. The connection of the golden dawn and animals and pleroma beyond to the woman committed to the liberation of dreams. From an overlap in the middle of a Venn diagram, Colquhoun watched him. So this Venn diagram being, Breton and Crowley, Surrealism, and Thelema, and that tradition of magic. And then jumping forward a bit again, we read, Now Jack could not get to Prague, but now too there was this not coincidence, this house of Surrealists. They too, meaning as well like they too, like Crowley and other Thelemites, other practitioners within the Thelemic tradition, they too were faithful to revolt and objective chance. Perhaps in their presence he might speak words close and transmogrifying power to those he had originally sought and planned to articulate. They went to set free the unconscious, Fry had told him. Desire. He shrugged. You'd have to ask them, he added, but Parsons did not think he would. With that gloss, he understood why Colquhoun would be in both this group and in Crowley's order. Now, again, Colquhoun wasn't actually in Crowley's order, but it sort of functions well enough for this fictional narrative here. Their aims were the same. I'm the leader of the Agape Lodge. The Agape Lodge was the local group of the Order Templi Orientis, that Crowley was the head of in Los Angeles and in Southern California, that Parsons was the head of for a time. Anointed by the great wizard himself, the young scientist was Crowley's chosen. I'm an apostle of freedom, like these guys, here to help my friend. So it occurs to me as I'm recording this here that I kind of made that offhand criticism of the show Strange Angel and the liberties it took with the Parsons story. Now, Miéville is also taking real, liberties with these storylines too, and bending facts here, like the idea that that Colquhoun was a member of Crowley's order. Here is not, historically accurate. He's taking liberties with the historical material and using them for his own purposes and to tell this fantasy narrative here, which both of those things are fine in themselves. But I think compared to the way that Strange Angel takes liberties, this story here, I think, really reveals something about both surrealism and Thelema, that something is drawn out in this connection that, speaking as someone who has a long-term interest in both Thelema and in surrealism. I've been involved in Thelemic groups for is it almost 15 years now, I guess, kind of off and on. And so I still maintain, some contact with people who are more involved in that world than I am. But I've sort of totally distanced myself from most of Thelema, and especially online Thelema, which can be quite toxic. And there's a whole very individualistic and very right-wing sort of contingent within Thelema that I really am not a fan of. But I think the way that, the image of Thelema that comes through here, sort of really reminds me anyways of what I think is most powerful within the Thelemic tradition, and what is still, I think, quite alive and potent within it, and also simultaneously brings out what's really, radical and powerful and magical within surrealism at the same time. So yeah, I just think that there's a really extraordinary insight here that comes through that I found. I read this novel or novella for the first time a couple years ago, and really found this connection here as a real kind of confirmation, especially through someone who's not actually a member of this tradition. Miéville is not a magical practitioner as far as I know, but the fact that he came to this insight, through this fictional narrative, I don't know. I found it as a real confirmation of some of my own, sort of intuitions, and the sense of that affinity there. And so I think it's quite exciting to see it articulated here in this narrative. All right, and then just to close off our discussion of surrealism and the link to Thelema and esotericism here, I'm going to dip just for a moment into one of the chapters from one of the 1950 chapters here, because I think it nicely kind of calls back to some of the discussions from the 1941 sections. So this is a dialogue between Thibaut, the protagonist in the 1950 narrative, and a secondary character that we're not really going to really talk about too much here, a companion that travels with him for a while. Her name is Sam. She is an American photographer with a deep knowledge of the occult and some occult powers of her, magical powers of her own, and is eventually revealed to be a spy for the forces of hell. And in that, I think there's some nice kind of pointed historical, political look at the American involvement in the European theater in World War II and America's motivations for getting involved there. But that's outside the scope of what we're talking about here. In any case, Thibaut and Sam are having a conversation here about her interest in how she got interested in surrealism. So she says, first it was monster pictures, she says, devils and bogeymen, witches, alchemy, magic. Then from there to here, I'm hardly the first to come that way. Think of Seligman, Colquhoun, Ernst de Givry, Flamel and Breton. You've read the second manifesto. I ask for the profound, the veritable occultation of surrealism. That's not what he meant by that, Thibaut says. He said he wanted to find the philosopher's stone, and he said he wanted to lose it again. So here we have a kind of argument or disagreement about this surrealist relationship to the occult or to esotericism, which reflects a real ambivalence within surrealism itself. It's something I talked about at more length in the video on surrealism, so you can check that out if you want to hear me talk about that some more. But I think it's nice that Miéville, although using that connection between the surrealism and the occult here, also it at least flags up this kind of ambivalence about the surrealist understanding of the occult and the way that fits with their commitment to Marxism and historical materialism. Again, touching on a lot of those themes that we talked about there back in Gothic Marxism, and some of that kind of tension within surrealism between that Marxist materialist understanding and the world of the imagination and magic and marvelous chance occurrences and everything else that we've already been talking about here. All right, so I think this is a good place to stop. I had intended to and I'm actually going to stop recording for the day. I'd intended to record this whole video and then just release it in 2 separate parts, but my voice is starting to go, so I'm going to stop recording for the day as well. So I'll be back in, less than a week with part 2 of this video, and then after that, we'll be starting the new series on Aleister Crowley, as I mentioned. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.